again to Agakala Reacts, and today we'll be watching top 10 shows that sucked after the first season. And that got my attention because the thumbnail was showing Altered Carbon, and I did love the books and I did love the first season. Let's just see how that's gonna go for the rest. Okay, let's go then.
You know it, I know it, we all know it. Sequels are a risk. If your original film was beloved, there's a lot of pressure not to mess that up with where you take the franchise next. The following TV series all started with so much promise, but no matter how long they ran for, or are still running for in some cases, they are so far removed from how they made you feel when they were fresh and new. I'm Cy from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 TV shows that sucked after the first season. Number 10, Jessica Jones. This one hurts because
I
the
remember
Netflix era of Marvel TV shows is
starting
very overlooked
watching it, but I never really finished.
The MCU in this day and age.
I mean, not even the first season, I think.
The underrated shows was Kristen Ritter's turn as Jessica Jones. For all the debate about finally getting female-led MCU movies like Captain Marvel in 2019 and Black Widow in 2021, Jessica had already beaten them to the punch by heading up her own show starting in 2015. The first season centered on topics that Marvel's blockbuster movies couldn't: assault, coercion, PTSD. Ritter perfectly played off against the salaciously hateable Kilgrave, as played by David Tennant. With its alcoholic protagonist and a hedonistic lifestyle, this wasn't the bright and shiny heroes of the silver screen, this was a look at how superpowers could affect normal lives. Later seasons had the occasional moment, and the cast performed well, but generic storylines that simultaneously dug into Jessica's estranged mother whilst her best friend gained her own superpowers completely lost the focus of what made the show great. Furthermore, Jessica's story was so specifically attached to Kilgrave, so when the villain was defeated at the end of season 1, it could never quite fill the void no matter what the writers tried. Number 9, Prison Break. It's very easy for not only us as an audience, but
the
also
first season was
filmmakers
amazing,
to go,
and then they
messed with the vision, and that's why it didn't turn out perfect, because studios can largely be looked at as just faceless corporations. However, in this case, Fox probably had the right idea to suggest to Prison Break showrunner Paul Scheuring to turn his concept into a mini-series rather than a full-on serialized show. Prison Break starred Wentworth Miller and Dominic Purcell as brothers in prison, one incarcerated for a murder they didn't commit, and the other choosing to join the behind bars expressly to use their talents to bust them both out. It was a brilliant concept for a show, one that had a very defined endpoint that it breezed right past. With the show's cast having escaped prison by the end of the first season, where on earth would Prison Break go next? On the run? Sure, but for how long? Oh, season, apparently. Then back to prison they go. And then out again. And then in? Is this a TV show or the hokey cokey? Season 2 wasn't altogether that bad, but the ending, with the brothers being arrested and taken to separate prisons, just felt a bit like numbing inevitability. We were essentially back to where we started. Over time, not only did the writing suffer, but the concept completely lost its way, and Prison Break found itself suddenly becoming a very dull government conspiracy show rather than bowing out gracefully. Number 8, Altered Carbon. When it was released, the first season of Altered Carbon was reportedly the most expensive series in Netflix production history, and
the fact that they cancelled it.
Bright, yet trashy,
I wasn't happy with the second season, but still.
Needed a high budget to pop off the screen. It's interesting that Netflix invested so much only to cancel the show after 2 seasons. Then again, the second season of Altered Carbon was a huge letdown from the first, and maybe Netflix saw the writing on the wall. Altered Carbon's strength was in its world, and the first season did a fantastic job of introducing us to its 360-year leap into the future. Humans can now upload their consciousness onto technology that can be basically dropped into a new body whenever it suits them. It raised a lot of interesting questions about morality and mortality.
Sit here, come in here.
Season 2's recast of lead character Takeshi was then perfectly logical for the plot, but altogether ungratifying. Anthony Mackie displayed none of the mannerisms nor the humour of the character that we had grown to love through Joel Kinnaman's previous appearance. Coupling this flat performance with the swift departure from the seedy cyberpunk world and into something hollow and more generic, Altered Carbon's second season felt like a totally different show, one that not only didn't get the same funds from Netflix, but also that didn't bother to actually grow its world, instead opting for cheap action sequences and a very dull story. Number 7, Once Upon a Time. To this day, Once Upon a Time presents a really unique concept for a show that deserves better treatment than what it got. Emma Swan meets her estranged son Henry, who takes her to the town of Storyville, a strange residence where everyone who lives there has been locked in an ageless amnesiac existence for 28 years. Furthermore, whether they realise it or not, Their true identities are all that of classic fairy tale characters. Swan discovers that she's the daughter of Snow White and Prince Charming, and part of a prophecy which will conclude with the final battle. The first season introduced us to the likes of Belle, the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio.
I did watch that show as well for quite a long time, for quite a lot of seasons, but I haven't finished it either because it just started getting really ridiculous. I don't know what that's about.
Forever chasing that feeling, Once Upon a Time story was put on the back burner so that it could introduce us to as many different recognizable names as possible, such as the Wicked Witch of the West and Captain Hook. With new characters coming in like some kind of fairy tale conveyor belt system, it meant pre-existing characters were rushed out of the show suddenly or very quickly, and thus the story of Once Upon a Time fell apart in short order. After all, why have a coherent plot when you can just have a ton of recognizable character names? Number 6, Star Trek Picard. The Star Trek franchise is in a strange place right now. Despite many of the shows having divisive reactions, the studio keeps churning out new programming, so they must be pretty happy with the state of things. Star Trek Picard is definitely a show that's had a variety of different responses so far. On the positive side, it is nice to see Patrick Stewart back in the franchise after an absence of about 2 decades, and bringing with him familiar faces and the concept of pushing the canon forward.
I mean, we just watched the second season recently, and I don't think it wasn't that bad.
And some promise for the future.
I know the third season is out as well, but we haven't had a chance to watch it yet.
Ran it into the dirt. It didn't help that it took basically every one of Trek's most tired tropes and combined them all. Things start in an alternate timeline where everyone is moustache-twirling levels of evil before jumping into a time travel story set in the boring modern day, and alongside all of this we have the reintroduction of the controversial Borg Queen, a character which, to some, shouldn't exist, considering she's the leader of a species which thrived on being a hive mind without a hierarchical system. Any of the exploration that Season 1 of Picard did around the character's later years was lost in Season 2's bizarre need to create a dark and brooding backstory for a character who had his resolutions about 3 decades ago. Just let the poor guy rest. Number 5, Revolution. The concept for J.J. Abrams' Revolution is the sort of thing that American drama is made for. Set in the not-too-distant future, the story follows the Matheson family as they try to survive in a post-apocalyptic world that suddenly lost all electric power some 50 years ago.
Yeah, sorry, I did watch that.
The Matheson family must dodge the Monroe militia
It was second season,
their benefactor who wants to get his hands on a mysterious pendant that the family has that holds the key to the entire blackout situation. The series' intrigue is born from the pendant, as well as the significance of a place called the Tower, and Revolution becomes about the journey to that truth. Season 2 lost that Odyssey feeling that the first had right off the bat, and it also did away with a lot of what made the first season so interesting. The pendants and the tower were no longer key factors, and now it was all about nanotechnology, which not only didn't have the same feeling, but also let the show totally jump the shark with things like mind control. Additionally, the Monroe militia was just dropped and outright replaced. It was almost like Season 2 was meant to feel like a reset. Revolution's promise slipped right through its fingers, so it's no wonder that NBC pulled the plug on it after its second season. Number 4, 13 Reasons Why. 13 Reasons Why was a lot about an altogether bold look at teenage depression as told by Hannah Baker, who, via 13 discovered tapes, chronicles the reasons why she chose to commit suicide. Season 1 of the show was a beautiful, self-contained story, and anything that followed was doomed to try and exist in its shadow. Whilst many shows find themselves jumping off a cliff, 13 Reasons went for the gold as if it was a competitive dive. Scarcely have shows imploded quite like this one did. Just to put a very fine point on it, Season 1 of 13 Reasons Why garnered a reasonable 76% Metacritic score that dropped to a 49% in the following year and a shockingly low 26% in its third season. The first season of 13 Reasons Why came under fire for covering and dramatising mental health and suicide, but it also had plenty of people defending it as an important and realistic portrayal of the struggles of teenage life. Season 2, however, lost most of its supporters when it became less of a study of the effects of depression and more just became an angsty show itself, culminating in an attempted school shooting and a shocking scene of sexual abuse. Essentially, the show stopped being about the reality of human trauma and instead just went for easy shock value. The writers persisted on, morphing the show's tone into a teenage drama murder mystery that completely got away from its original message and began to romanticize the futility of it all. Number 3, Westworld. Westworld is just another perfect example, sadly like many on this list, of a show that everyone was talking about for a few weeks, and now more often than not you'll hear people asking, hey, whatever happened to that? The show's slower release schedule, every 2 years as opposed to every year, hasn't
I watched all of the
retained
seasons
viewers,
so far,
but about
so
halfway through season 2 of the show, its numbers very swiftly dropped. For those that never saw it, Westworld was based on a 1970s film of the same name about a futuristic amusement park that allowed its visitors to partake in some seriously wild and often disturbing fantasies via its reliance on artificial intelligence. I don't think it's fair to say that season 2 is a dumpster fire, not by any means, but its already complex world was buckling under its own weight as it was, and the further we got into the story, the more incomprehensible it became. The amount of flashbacks and flash forwards was making the show more of a chore to watch than felt necessary. Look, high art is great and all, but a lot of people just want to be entertained, and Westworld was starting to be seen as too pretentious for its own good. Furthermore, Westworld just didn't have anything deep to say. The promise of it was clever, but it failed to have any actual depth to back it up. Number 2, Riverdale. Despite the fact that it's 5 years into its run, the idea of a dark and gritty reboot of the Archie comics, of all things, still makes me laugh. I mean, we've had dark and gritty versions of everything else, so why not? More surprising is that it was actually good, at least to start with. Riverdale did a wonderful thing, casting a series of unknowns, including KJ Apper and Lily Reinhart, alongside established actors who had a history of performing in teenage coming-of-age stories, such as Molly Ringwald and Luke Perry. It then shook them up and put them in a strange, dark world.
Never seen it either.
Riverdale had a lot of surprisingly engaging characters and interesting story points, all centered around the suspicious circumstances of the death of the town's star quarterback that unraveled over time. But when the second season tried to take things wider and a little bit weirder, Riverdale lost its footing, and ever since it's felt like it's fallen further and further away from that original intrigue and magic. Gangs and long-lost brothers and characters introduced right at the last moment to throw a fake out into everything are on the menu for season 2 alone, and this was only a taste of the absolute bonkers to come. Later seasons include cults, and Archie being literally attacked by a bear. Despite its original intrigue, Riverdale very quickly meandered off and became a series of needlessly shocking moments with a convoluted story loosely tying things together. Number 1, Heroes. The original
Another one I have never seen it. Well, it's weird because I like stuff like that.
Time, airing in 2006 and 2007. This was just before the Marvel Cinematic Universe began to lay the groundwork for superpowered humans becoming a huge part of the next decade of pop culture. Instead of being about spandex-wearing do-gooders, Heroes was instead about a series of normal, seemingly disconnected people around the world
from Star Trek?
gaining new abilities.
It is, isn't it?
From teleporting Hero to the flying nurse Peter, from future painting Isaac to the impervious cheerleader Claire, Heroes was leading the new wave of television's high-concept storytelling in its first season.
Damn, guys, I actually want to watch it.
And the mysteries it laid out for its audience were the stuff that water cooler discussion was made for. Many people would say that the 2007-2008 Writers Guild of America strike was the thing that killed Heroes off, but this isn't so. Sure, having its second season essentially cut in half didn't help, but the actual pacing and writing for its second volume was not what its established audience wanted to see. Season 2 isolated its most overpowered characters off with plot-convenient storylines that stopped them from interacting with the wider arc so that it could be a slow build. But Season 1 had already been a slow build, and by now the audience wanted to capitalise upon that momentum. They may have saved the cheerleader and saved the world, but Heroes couldn't save itself from what Season 2 did to the show's initial promise. And that's the list. Let us know in the comments below what you thought of this video and of any other TV shows that you know that fell off the wagon right after season 1. And I'm sure many of you will disagree with some of these takes, and that's okay.
Nothing really comes to mind at the moment. I think they kind of covered most of them.
Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell. I'm Si from WhatCulture.com, and have a good week. You know it.
Yeah, so what did you think about this? Because, well, I can agree with some of them. Like, definitely not Westworld. Westworld actually too a bit. The first season was very good, then the second one was, I think, was kind of mess. But we still keep going with it till the last season, and then they announced that they're not going to do the final season at all. So I would like to see how that concluded, but well, it's not going to happen now. And definitely Altered Carbon. The problem with Altered Carbon for me was that they kind of veered way too much from the books. Maybe not too much, but they kind of mixed, because there's 3 books there, and they kind of mixed what was happening in the second season. It was kind of mix of what was happening in the second and the third book. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.